All right. Welcome to this year's Tabula Poetica reading series. I think we've been doing this for 7 years now. I can't believe it. I can't believe I've been here that long. This project brings poets to Chapman University to read their work and to talk about poetry. We have 4 visiting poets this fall, and the series concludes, as usual, with the MFA poetry reading in December. I want to thank all of you for coming out in the heat. Rumor has it that this is the hottest September day ever here. I have not confirmed that, but that's the buzz on campus. So thank you for coming out to listen to poetry in the heat. Yes, take out your cell phone right now. And if you want to tweet that you're here or post it on Facebook, great, do that, and then silence your phone. And while you're doing that, I'm going to thank some of the people and organizations that make Tabula Poetica possible. Most of the support for this project comes from the English department. And there are particular people I want to thank from the English department, and we'll give them a round of applause. Some of them are here. So the chair, Joanna Levin, our administrative assistants, Debbie Thacker and Kristen Laxo, and my graduate assistant, David Krausman. So Joanna and David are right here. Thank you. This year, we also have support from the Dean of Students Office, the Department of History, and the Rogers Center for Holocaust Education. Without these co-sponsors and a great gift from the Chancellor's Office for today's visit, Carolyn Forché wouldn't be here. Leatherby Libraries and Fish Interfaith Center, where you are today, continue to be great hosts for our events. There will be snacks at the reading at 4 o'clock later, and the library is providing those snacks. And Dean Charlene Baldwin in the library has championed Tabula Poetica from day one, or even before day one. Today, we welcome the acclaimed poet Carolyn Forché to Chapman University. I first read Carolyn's poems as an undergraduate myself, a few years after The Country Between Us was published. I imagine many in the audience today have read the prose poem, The Colonel, which is widely anthologized. While that poem is emblematic of Forché as a politically engaged poet, it pointed me to new ways of thinking about structure and image, pacing and phrasing. In the first class meeting this semester, my students and I talked about these issues in that poem and also in the lineated poem, San Onofre, California, that opens that early collection. I pointed to the line, "It is enough to listen." But of course, for the poet, listening leads to writing. And listening becomes the reader's way into the poem's content and meaning as well. I met Carolyn Forché for the first time at this past spring's AWP conference, and I mentioned that I taught at Chapman University with Richard Bausch and Daniele Strupa. She immediately expressed interest in traveling to meet to talk with our students here. As I've reread Carolyn's latest book, Blue Hour, which will be available for sale at this afternoon's reading if you don't have that already, I've been struck by the juxtaposition of the detail with the abstract, the question with the statement. In the long poem, On Earth, she writes, "There is no absence that cannot be replaced. There is no reason for the world." How can anyone read that and not ponder life more deeply and also continue reading on? There was no when there. There was nothing that wasn't for sale. I advise my students to go through their writing to eliminate there is, there are, there was, it is, and so on. I tell them that these are placeholders they used to start the sentence before they actually figured out what they wanted to say. I tell them that this will make their writing, eliminating these phrases, will make their writing much stronger and also their critical writing. So they'll be able to fool their literature professors if they unclutter their language and use real nouns as sentence openers, as subjects. I say that it will get clearer by getting rid of such wording. And then we read this poem in Blue Hour, full of what shouldn't belong, but does belong, and is in fact necessary and powerful in its placeholding and repetition. I remain in awe of Carolyn Forché's work, both because of the subject matter with which she's willing to grapple, subject matter that is sometimes uncomfortable and from which most of us shy away, and also because of the ways in which she uses language, the ways in which she makes a simple phrase mean the world. Please welcome Carolyn Forché.
Thank you, Anna. That was wonderful. I'm so glad we cooked this up for me to come to Chapman. You have a beautiful university look. It's amazing. So I'm loving seeing Dick Bausch again. We were partners in crime for 15 years at George Mason University, where Daniele Struppa was our dean. So I'm back for a kind of reunion at Chapman. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes about something that's been very important to my life and work. And then I'm open to, in this intimate setting, any questions you might have at all on any subject. For many years, I've been reading and collecting the works of poets who endured extremity and wrote in its aftermath. This effort began 3 years after my return from El Salvador in early 1980, in the time of the death squads, those years of horror that preceded the war to overthrow a military dictatorship. After that, I also traveled and worked in Beirut, Lebanon, and South Africa in the late years of apartheid. And certain of these experiences, in mosaic chips of images, remembered speech, and incident, began to appear in my poems. At first, I didn't recognize the dangers inherent in failing to repress such material, that it was regarded by some as inappropriate for poetry. That is to say, the poetry written in my country in that period. That it would be regarded as political, a vaguely defined term, almost always pejoratively deployed. Political poetry, admitting of contemporary and often controversial events, was considered inevitably to fail, insofar as it subsumed lyric art beneath a programmatic mission of persuasion. One cannot, however, separate the political as a category of abstract thinking from political events as such. And although within the horizon of political horror, poetry offers a fragile response, the ethos of poetry nevertheless constitutes a response. The problem for the poet who would wish to consciously respond to political events in poetry is that poetry is not inductive, deductive, or ideological. It is non-ideological, a deftly nuanced argument delineating the distinction between the occasion of the poem, its originary event, and the poem as an act of language. If one is genuinely writing something, rather than attempting to write about something, as Beckett famously said of Joyce, then it seems to me that poets have little conscious choice in the matter. Their art emerges on paper before it is known to themselves. It begins, as I have written, in a not knowing rather than a moral impulse. Words and language are not wrappings in which things are packed for the commerce of those who write and speak. It is in words and language that things first come into being and are. A poet's consciousness is in this sense improvisational and open to transformations, felicitous accidents, and an intuitive response to language generating meaning and music. That is true whether the spark igniting the poem comes from the word, a phrase, an image, or a moment in experience, present or remembered. This spark is what the Russian poet Osip Mandelstam calls poriv, or impulse, and what Emerson thinks of as what is oldest and best in us, the alien visitor. This not knowing is a hovering and receptive state of consciousness without intention or conscious knowledge of its direction. We play with it and revise it after the fact, bearing down on the poem with our always incommensurate knowledge of the resources of our art. I know that consciousness can be incised by experience, seared by memory, awakened by what is seen and lived, and that the poet's language also passes through this fire and is marked by it. The surrender of conscious control so necessary to the receptive artistic state does not mean that the mark of experience will not be burned into the poem and be made legible there. When we read for this mark, we read for witness. And at times, along with aesthetic pleasure and the frisson of newly made meanings, we are also not perhaps persuaded, but certainly transported to regions of experience that might inform our conscience, so as to make art in the light of it, as Marina Tsvetaeva once proposed. The thought of poetry of witness is an effort to understand the impress of extremity upon the poetic imagination. What happens to the poets and the languages of the poets who have experienced warfare, military occupation, house arrest, forced exile, imprisonment, and other forms of state-imposed suffering? Many poets have endured these experiences during the 20th and 21st centuries throughout the world. As these poets were wounded, so too was their language, which also passed through violence. And I would argue that regardless of the content of their poems, this mark remains legible. In his essay, Many Thousand Gone, James Baldwin writes, "It is not a question of memory. Oedipus did not remember the thongs that bound his feet. Nevertheless, the marks they left testified to that doom toward which his feet were leading him. The man does not remember the hand that struck him, the darkness that frightened him as a child. Nevertheless, the hand and the darkness remain with him, indivisible from himself forever, part of the passion that drives him wherever he thinks to take flight." Memory is wounded space, not only a spring or a well, but also a tomb. Memory inters and excavates the ruin. Memory can be tainted, anguished, humiliated. Anguished memory eliminates repose. It pits authenticity against logic, and the failure to connect these two undoes every model and code. During recent years, as was inevitable, the term witness has been variously interpreted. Witness came to refer much of the time to the person of the poet, much as it refers to a man or woman testifying under oath in a court of law. Poets of witness have been considered by some to be engaged in writing documentary literature or poetic reportage in the mode of political confessionalism. As compelling as many such witness poems are, poetry of witness originated in a very different constellation of thought, in which it was not art regarded as constituting a poet's identity, nor prescribing a new engaged literature. Poetry of witness, a term descending from the literature of the Holocaust and complicated by philosophical, religious, linguistic, and psychoanalytic understandings of witness, remains to be amplified. In my sense of the term, it is a mode of reading rather than of writing, of readerly encounter with the literature of that which happened. And its mode is evidentiary rather than representational, as evidentiary, in fact, as spilled blood. When I was asked to define a poetry of witness by an editor in New York more than 20 years ago, well, I was in front of a boardroom filled with editors of W.W. Norton. I had never made a book presentation before, and I didn't know what I was doing. That's why the receptionist disappeared after I asked her for some coffee. I told her I didn't have a real presentation prepared. I told the story of Miklos Vrednoti. I decided the only way I can help these people to understand this anthology I want to compile on poetry of witnesses to tell the story of one of them. I believe in stories. So does my colleague Dick Bausch. I told the story of Miklos Radnoti, foremost Hungarian poet of his generation, who in 1944 was sent to do forced labor in the country that would later become, and once was, Yugoslavia. In the labor camp, the poet was able to get himself a small notebook into which he inscribed his last 10 poems, as well as a message he wrote in Hungarian, Croatian, German, French, and English. The message was, contains the poems of Hungarian poet Miklos Radnoti, to Mr. Gulya Ortutai, Budapest University lecturer, thank you in advance. When it was clear they would be defeated, the Germans evacuated the camp and attempted to return the workers to Hungary. Radnoti, assuming that the first column would be the safest one, volunteered for the march and recorded it in his poetry. Of the more than 2,000 men on this forced winter march, 22 survived, among them the poet Miklos Radnoti. Once in Hungary, the soldiers in charge beat and shot him to death, along with 21 others, and buried them in a shallow common grave. However, the story does not end, as millions of such stories did end, with execution and the anonymity of a common grave. After the war, Radnoti's widow, Fanny Germati, was among those who found and exhumed the grave near the village of Abda. Fanny Radnoti found the small notebook of poems on her husband's exhumed body, tucked into the pocket of an overcoat. She dried its pages in the sun. And this, I explained to the editors in New York, was what I meant by poetry of witness. So, in an interview, Adam Czernowski tells the Polish poet Tadeusz Rozowicz, who was a Holocaust survivor, that he, Rozowicz, is a poet who has recorded the time of terror, disaster, and agony. To express this, he says, you have created a minimal poetry that has ranged itself against all poetry. For the last 30 years, he went on, you have been running away from poetry. From the very beginning, you were saying that poetry is finished, that one could not be a poet in 1945, a statement that echoes the oft-quoted and misunderstood proclamation of Theodor Adorno that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. Rozowicz responded by saying that he was of two minds, one belonging to the poet who valued and read Eliot and Auden, and the other a realist who said to himself, listen, don't take any notice of what people have been writing. Don't bother writing yourself. This happens to be your present situation. You are living through a particular time, confronting certain events. Throw everything away. If you can't create a poetry that will be a new form of human existence, the whole effort is not worth the candle. Despite this crisis of disillusionment, however, Rozowicz found a language for his radical cry of the heart, in a honed, spare, and has been said, almost whispered lyric. They tell me, he said, that my poems are as spontaneous as the cry of a terrified man, that I have uttered a cry of despair on behalf of a whole generation. Yes, I have uttered a cry, but before that, I had worked upon the form that cry was to take. His artistic rigor and discipline remained, and when asked about his seeming love-hate relationship with poetry, that is, the radical doubt to which he subjected everything, including his genre, he answered, not just love and hate. There is also irony, sarcasm, contempt, and indifference. What he desired was a poetry of absolute transparency, so that the dramatic material might be seen through the poem, just as in clear water you can see what is moving on the bottom. These are not philosophical poems, he said. They think with images. His compatriot, the Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert, echoes this observation. I avoid any commentary. I keep a tight hold on my emotions. I write about the facts. In his wakeful poems, he too struggles toward a clear-eyed, dispassionate defense of morality and human dignity, creating as his survivor the figure of Mr. Cogito. So this guy descends from the idea of Descartes, right? Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And he admonished that we should begin by doubting everything. He believed poetry to be quite literally a struggle for breath. It is low-voiced in its proclamations and yet boldly calls for courage. This is from Zbigniew Herbert's poetry. Go upright among those who are on their knees, among those with their backs turned and those toppled in the dust. You were saved not in order to live. You have little time, you must give testimony. Be courageous when the mind deceives you. Be courageous in the final account. Only this is important. It is as if Herbert feels that he has nothing with which to work, and he makes of that nothing an instrument. He wanted to make it an instrument of compassion. He wanted to understand to the very end. Wisława Szymborska, Polish poet who won a Nobel Prize, not belatedly, but not too many years ago, shares with her compatriots an exacting scrutiny of the world, believing memory and imagination have moral significance. She retrieves from the debris isolated moments and gestures in perpetual wonder at the accident of being. She writes, this one, and not that. And why am I here on a day that's a Tuesday, in a house, not a nest, in skin, not in scales, with a face, not a leaf? Why only once in my very own person, precisely on earth, under this little star, after so many years of not being here? She creates in her poems a different lyric self, not the I of the confessional lyric or the autobiographical self, but a more protean one, born of many deaths of the self, who invites us to regard the world along with her, a world so fragile that all within it may be momentarily consigned to oblivion. In her Nobel Prize acceptance speech, she says, whatever inspiration is, it's born from a continuous, I don't know. Ideologues, she remarks, always know. They don't want to find out about anything else, since that might diminish the force of their arguments. Poets, if they are genuine, must always keep repeating, I don't know. Each poem marks an effort to answer this statement, but as soon as the final period hits the page, the poet begins to hesitate, starts to realize that this particular answer was pure makeshift, absolutely inadequate. This hesitancy before the page is a species of necessary humility. Reaching adulthood at the beginning of the Nazi occupation of Poland, it is possible that these three poets did not survive as the selves they might once have become. Adorno speculates that such people will be plagued by dreams, such that he is no longer living at all, that he was sent to the ovens in 1944, and his whole existence since has been imaginary, an emanation of the insane wish of a man killed 20 years earlier. They swerved from the realm of dreams, however, for a clear-eyed appraisal of their milieu, and paired their poetry to a chiseled language in which moments are isolated and preserved. The lost and forgotten are attended. Previous knowledge is unsettled, and memory and imagination have moral significance. The Egyptian-born Jewish poet Edmund Jabez wrote, to Adorno, the German philosopher who has said we cannot write after Auschwitz, I say we must write, but we cannot write like before. Adorno himself later acknowledged that the abundance of suffering tolerates no forgetting. This suffering is consciousness of adversity and demands the continued existence of an art while it prohibits it. It is now virtually in art alone that suffering can still find its own voice, consolation, without immediately being betrayed by it. The most important artists of the age have realized this. In reading the poetry of witness across time, languages, and borders, a connective tissue of images and concerns becomes legible. shared tendencies toward rupture and fragment, tools and devices for poetic lock-picking, for magnification, pairing, and chiseling, and also one finds instruments within the poems for navigating history, excavating memory, and writing what cannot be written. Some of these shared qualities include the poet's explicit appeal to be believed, attempts to console the reader in advance, the difficulties of remembering and forgetting, the appearance of memory, war, and death as figures, an awareness of temporal shifts and a change of epochs, the illusion of the past as if it were dreamt, of the past as another country, the experience of the self as fragmented, the self as a stranger, and of time as radically altered, the taking of inventories, especially of what has been lost, the sense of loss of the distinction between combatants and non-combatants in warfare, the attempt to come to terms with evil and its embodiments, a compulsion to address the dead, as well as figures of war and death, a command to bear witness, appeals to others for a shared sense of humanity, expressions of faith in the redemptive power of poetry, the recognition of the failure of language and words, attempts to write from within imprisonment and exile, to write in the midst and aftermath of battle, to write of the unspeakable, the ineffable, and to come to terms with evil and its embodiments, to posit logic and causality in an indeterminate world, to write in the 20th century and for the first time, of the skies as raining death and destruction, to speak of an irrevocable past and attempt to address the generations to come, to resolve to survive and to work, obeying the voice in Czesław Miłosz's poem, The Messenger, do what you can. These are the threads linking poets who have written in the aftermath of extremity during the past 100 years and a decade and a half. Blood appears often in these poems. I think of literary writing as a means of retrieving a human knowledge irretrievable by other means. I think of literary writing as a means of retrieving a human knowledge irretrievable by other means. You could also say creating that knowledge. Composing poems and writing stories is a meditative spiritual act of resistance. It requires a capacity to sustain contemplation, to be attentive to all that is about us, and to hold within ourselves an awareness that we are here in our living moment between two unknown realms, before our births and after our deaths. We speak through art to the millennia of artists who came before us, and the art we will make will send its messages to the human future. Curiosity about our predecessors and care for our descendants is a collective accomplishment. Art is what is left behind, and art is what we will leave to the world to come. We gaze at the same moon as the cave painters of Chauvet, even though there are now boot prints upon that moon. The wine-dark seas of Homer are still our seas, even if a part of their waters are now dead zones in a sea of plastic. If we retain our capacity for meditative awareness, the language of art that allows us to speak through time will not be lost. The slow, solitary engagement with music and word, paint and light, with our bodies in space and time, that is the precondition of making art, might not only preserve our capacities as artists, but as humans possessed of intuitive intelligence and inner life. Poets and artists are conversant with centuries of their kind, and their visions may address the most pressing need of the epoch, our epoch, that of saving the biosphere of Earth, thus preserving her flora and fauna as well as our own kind, with our probative and dangerous intelligence, our inventiveness, glorious consciousness shimmering between two darknesses in what we regard as time. Poetry is the deep musical articulation of this awareness. And whatever may be said of our precarious literary art, poetry needs no justification, but must only endure and that is in the hands of its practitioners of the moment. And that's my talk. And that's what I have to say. Okay, so I think we have some time for questions, and I will answer anything. I'm not shy or embarrassed, well, maybe a little, but please ask whatever you want. Yes, sir.
Well, I have a question about committed poetry and the teaching of poetry, because I was thinking about what you were saying about how your early work sort of went against the poetry establishment. And I think that's still true to some extent in this country. I grew up in apartheid South Africa, where it was the opposite. If you didn't write political committed poetry, your
Right.
poetry was considered a frivolous luxury, right? So it was sort of imperative to write that kind of poetry. And I'm thinking also of Junot Diaz's criticism of creative writing programs as the whiteness of creative writing programs, not only in terms of the bodies, but in terms of the kind of writing that's taught, and the recent AWP kerfuffle about diversity. So
Oh, that's ongoing. That's still happening. There's kerfuffle after kerfuffle.
So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about creative writing programs and committed writing and how you see, I mean, and I'm also curious to know how you teach poetry, because there seems to be a lot of attention, focus on formalism in creative writing workshops, which seems to kind of go against the imperative to write to committed poetry, for instance. I'm just curious how you see creative writing programs playing into these ideas and how you teach creative writing, and how you teach poetry writing.
Well, first of all, I want to say that that as a person born in the aftermath of the Second World War, prior to the Second World War, most of the poets you will find in anthologies were born of privilege, and they had privileged educations and opportunities to travel and to have the leisure to write. They didn't really have to be employed necessarily, most of them. And after the Second World War, the GI Bill allowed our fathers to go to receive higher education. And by the time I was of age, we had, which you don't have anymore, I'm very sorry, but we had National Defense Student Loans and Equal Opportunity Grants, so we didn't have to go into indentured servitude for the rest of our lives to be educated. We had to pay back loans, but they were small. I apologize to you for us letting go of those programs, but I'm a product of the Great Society. I don't know whether you want this whole lecture, but I'm going to tell you that I wouldn't have been able to become a writer at all had it not been for walking into a creative writing workshop as an undergraduate and having the teacher of that workshop later guide me towards something I had never heard of, which is a Master of Fine Arts in poetry. And it was the first time in my life I'd done a lot of terrible jobs, and some very moving, wonderful jobs too, but I walked into that program, I hate the term, but I walked into that community of writers, my peers and the faculty guiding us, although I will have to tell you that most of the time it's your peers that you're coming along with as writers. Those are the people you stay up all night with, reading to each other and criticizing each other, and I learned a great deal from my peers, and I had these precious 2 years to write a book and to live in a community of writers. And it was astonishing to read and to write every day for 2 whole years. And I wrote the book that became my first published volume of the Yale series. So I saw that time as a great democratization of higher education, and later, the offshoot of that was, tangentially, a great democratization of literary culture. All of a sudden, you could read poets who weren't born of privilege. You could read poets whose fathers worked in factories. You could read African American poetry, and you could read Latino poetry, and you could read Native American poetry that, believe me, you would have trouble finding prior to the Second World War. And so that, on the positive side, these programs they began as only a handful. And that proliferation allowed many, many people to have access to this practice. Now, not all of them became geniuses, and not all of them stuck with it, and not all of them developed the discipline, which is really what you have to develop. Lots of people are gifted. Can you sit in the chair by yourself in a room? That's the issue. Okay, so I feel like this created an incredible world and opportunity. And yes, it mirrored its dominant culture. In other words, yes, for a long time, most of the people in these programs and at AWP were whites. They even called it all white poets for a while as a joke. But what happened? Now there are 15,000 people wandering around in some great convention center, bigger than a dentist's convention, and you see that we're something. We might be scattered all around, we might be isolated somewhere in the world, but we're all writing. We're from these little towns. We see each other once a year among 15,000 people. It's a little daunting. And yeah, it's a little bit too white yet, a little bit too this, a little bit too that, but it's moving and it's working and it's changing and it's doing as much as anything else in this culture is doing. And the fights, the kerfuffles are mandatory. They have to be happening. They're what keeps the thing mixing up. And we have to have people challenging what we're doing and provoking and questioning. We have to have Juno Diaz, who's a friend of mine, who stands up and says, hey, you guys, this is what you're doing, you know? And half of what he says is spot on, and half of what he says, he's spinning it out, you know? But it's important. His engagement, his dialogue, his challenges are important. So I don't put creative writing programs in a category. I think they're wildly various. And now there are poets who were experimental, who used to feel shut out of them, now have their own programs. And the programs have programs. There are grandpa programs and grandchildren programs all over the country. And I can't help but think that there was an accusation, writing workshops are the last bastion of human subjectivity. Good. We need at least one last bastion. Okay, to develop a sense of inner life and the worth of language and stories. And you see, I've answered this question before, but I'm not saying that there's not a lot of problems. I'm saying that we can't go back to the days when you had to be born with an income, a small income, what they used to call a small income. It means a trust fund. You can't go back to those days and have those be your writers and not hear from anyone else. So is that what we want to do, really? I'm worried not just about the survival of writing, but the survival of engagement with inner life, the survival of the humanities on the campuses, as you're all being pushed towards STEM, as you're all being channeled in certain vocational utility programs of study. What's going to happen when there's vast STEM unemployment? Then what? So even if you're in STEM, you need to have some space for your mind and your life and your heart and your sensibility to form and flourish. That's what you really need. And I think, okay, you write. It feels incredible to write. Does it mean you're going to go off and be Juno Diaz? Not necessarily, you know, but you'll have the experience Juno Diaz has had, and that's important. So in terms of engaged writing, you are going to write about your deepest obsessions no matter what. If your deepest obsessions have to do with the experience of oppression, that will be on the page no matter what you write about. That'll be on the page from the minute you open the window. You don't have to worry about that. What you have to worry about is allowing your mind fully to speak and not just your conscious preoccupations of the moment. If you're guided by an impulse to argue something, write the genius form of the argumentative essay, the persuasive essay. That's where you can articulate an argument beautifully with the space to do it in. Poems, you have to start with nothing. Stories, I think you have to start with nothing. I'm not a fiction writer, Dick Bausch can answer this, but you always have to start with nothing, and you have to not know where you're going for a long time. I think it was a doctor who said, it's like driving in the fog with only your lowlights, not your headlights. You can't see very far, but you can make the whole trip that way. And that's how it feels to wander through a prose book and trying to make it. So I'm a big proponent of keeping the space open for writing. You know, I don't care whether it's called Master of Fine Arts, and I don't care whether it's 2 years or 3 years, and it doesn't matter to me. What matters is that accomplished, experienced writers have the chance to mentor new ones and have the chance to show them the skills they need and show them the discipline they need and encourage them. That's what needs to exist. It doesn't matter what you call it. OP, AWP, it doesn't matter. That organization exists to let people know they're not alone. That's my opinion of that organization. I was its president years and years ago. That was not an easy thing to do, and so I understand all the problems. But to let people know they're not alone, that's worth everything. Yeah.
You said in that doctorate with the...
It had low lights, yeah.
The best expression I've ever heard is yours.
What?
You said it's a path you take. And
Yeah.
you make the
Path as you
by
walk.
taking-
I stole that from Poet Steele. I stole it from Antonio Machado. Caminante no hay camino, se hace camino al andar. Walker, there is no path. You make the path while you walk. And you're right. I lived in South Africa at the end of the apartheid years. Well, it wasn't quite the end. Nobody knew it was the end. We thought it was the middle. But there was a pressure then to write a certain way or you weren't significant. That pressure exists now here in lots of ways. You have to tear up that pressure and open a blank sheet of paper and start at the beginning. And don't worry about your ethos, your ethics, your concerns, your values. They will all be eventually legible on the page. You don't have to worry. They're going to be there anyway. All your flaws, all your grammatical mistakes, that's all going to be there. So then you revise and you revise and you revise and you make decisions. But I advise you to make the decisions in the interests of language and literary art, rather than in the interests of, I have to cross that out because that's not important, that's not political. Never do that. How do you know what's political in the future? How do you know what the questions are going to be? We don't. Write for the future. Write because someone's going to find it, someday. I won't paint some horrible apocalyptic vision for you, but write for the future. What else do you want to know? My answers are too long, I'm afraid, but yeah.
In your poem Hive, the last line you say is, we are so made that nothing contents us. And I was wondering what was your inspiration and your ideas behind to end the poem on such a...
It's dark, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, the Hive poem, I was interested in bees, and oddly, that's before bees were dying. It was a long time ago. And I was just looking at colonies of things, because when you look at humans building something from a distance, and then you look at an anthill or some other colony, there's a lot of resemblance there. You watch people from way far away crawling around and doing things and moving things around and shoving the earth. And then you watch the ants and they're carrying leaves and they're doing, so I was thinking we're a colony species, that's what we are, And so what is it, if you back up from being a human, what are we making? What are we doing? What is this supposed to be, But you guys have probably had that little exercise, almost like you're not even from here, meaning Earth, You're just watching in a kind of strange wonder. And so I was studying the colony species for a while. For a while it was bats, and then it was ants, and then it was bees. And so I wrote this poem, and what I wanted to do was write about bees. So I stuck to the bees. But I could feel all the way through the bee poem that underneath it there was human society, and it was kind of, pumping under the poem. And I didn't want it to be explicit. I just let it pump under the poem. So, but on the surface it's about bees. And then at the end I let it merge. I got that line out of nowhere. We are so made that, why? We are so made that nothing contents us. So we're always going to be doing things. Not all of them good. So whatever it is that we're making or doing, it's a collective thing. We're all part of it, but we're not directing it. It's a lot like creating something on the page. We're not really directing it. We're just, collecting things and letting them be on the page. Does that make sense? Okay. I was reading Maeterlinck and bees, something, the enigma of the hive or something like that. Yeah. And then the bees started to die, and then I got scared. I thought I better not write about this stuff anymore. Yeah. Oh, and we're just spraying now. We're spraying. You guys are being sprayed at night after 10 p.m. Did you know that? For mosquito West Nile. Yeah, go inside, close your windows after 10 o'clock. It dampens the party, but do it anyway. What else? Do we have time for another one? Yes, sir.
We recently heard about the Poetry of Witness film that's coming out. Can you tell us about that?
The Poetry of Witness what?
The film, the interview.
Oh, yeah. Billy Tuma? Is that the one? I don't know. He came to my house and asked me a lot of questions, turned the camera on. So I have no idea. I have no idea. I haven't, okay. He sent me the DVD, and I put it on top next to the DVD player. And then I thought, yeah, I'll watch this. But I haven't been able to put it in the slot because I don't like to see myself or hear myself. I don't like the sound of my voice, and I don't want to see myself, on a camera. So if I could find out a way to, maybe one of you can tell me how to speed through the parts I'm in and watch the rest of it, I will put it in the slot and watch it. But I don't have an opinion yet because I haven't worked up my courage to watch it. So even people know about it? Oh, darn. That's terrifying, right? Billy Tuma.
Fame of the poet.
Yeah, oh, no. I hope it's okay. I'm sure he's a very nice guy. I liked him. He's a community college teacher, and I have deep respect for community college teachers. They do an amazing work, and community college students also are very exciting, community colleges. That's why I said yes to him, because he worked at a community college. I hope that was okay, Yeah.
One last question.
It's cool in here, you're gonna have to go outside. Yes?
You're quite an accomplished poet, and it's always fascinating to me that you've written one book in approximately a decade.
Yeah.
And we talked about this a little bit at lunch, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that, just that sensibility of patience in your writing process, and how it feels very different than many of the writers writing today, which is at a more rapid speed and trying to get work out.
Well, I'm of a generation, though, before it sped up. But also, I've been writing since I was a pretty young kid. I was 9. And so I was doing it just for doing it. I wasn't doing it. When you grow up the daughter of a tool and die maker, you do not imagine yourself becoming, it doesn't even enter into it that you might be a published writer someday. That's just not possible. Any more than you might go to Europe someday, or you might go skiing someday even. None of that was possible. So I just did it because I loved doing it. And then I was a little too young when I published my first book, and I wasn't used to people being able to read my poems that I hadn't actually given them to personally, that I didn't know. And I had a very bad reaction to the fact that anybody could read it, even write about it, even have opinions, even attack it or anything. I just thought, well, I don't know these people. Why do they have my book? I know that sounds stupid and naive, but it wasn't a good experience. And then the second book didn't help, because the second book was very controversial, because it was viewed as political, because it was about El Salvador, and the United States government was supporting the government of El Salvador, so that therefore I'm political, and therefore my poems are political. That wasn't a good experience either, so I slowed down again. It was 7 or 8 years between the first and second one, then it was 10 years. Until the third one. Then it was 11 years until the fourth one. Now it's been 13 years. And, because now, I just like the period before you publish. The period when it's still yours. You still can work on it and tweak it and revise it. I love revision. And, I love revising. If I publish it, I'm going to have to start over, and I won't have anything to revise for a while. Do you see? And revision is really where it is for me. But revision is where the magic happens, actually. So, if you don't like revision because you don't like crossing things out and changing them up and doing them again, that's a bad sign. You need to fall in love with revision. So, not as badly as I have, and don't be as slow as I am. But publishing isn't everything. The joy of writing is everything. And maybe you'll be published and maybe you won't, but publishing is a mixed bag. The novelists I know love to see their books in form of a book, but they don't like to go on book tours. They don't like to run all over every night a different city talking about their book, saying the same things over and over. They're happy that people are listening and reading, but my gosh, every night a different city. and they don't even have a rock band or groupies or anything. They're just going by themselves, so, right? So it's not so hard. They crab about it a lot. That's what they crab about. And the other thing they do is compete with each other about how long they can sit in a chair in a room by themselves. I listened to Bread Loaf once when I was really young to a bunch of novelists standing around, and they said, yeah, but I can do it for 8 hours a day. And I know what they were talking about. Another guy says, yeah, well, I've gone 12 hours, 14 hours, and sometimes for weeks at a time. They're just telling each other this, and I'm thinking, what are they talking about? Finally, I realized it was writing.
I was in a car with Joyce Carol, and she said, how's your work going? I said, well, I'm nearing the end of it now, so I'm getting long days, and I'm getting up to 10 hours a day. And she went, oh, only 10 hours.
Well,
And she said, it's a joke.
Joyce just sleeps and writes. Anyway, it was wonderful to see you. I'm giving a reading somewhere in the library at 4 o'clock. If you can come, I'd love to see you there, and I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for having me. Okay.